Hey, what's going on, guys? I'm Gaming here, back into the video. Today's episode, we're taking a look at how to play Ryze in the mid lane. And Ryze is a very interesting champion because he is probably one of the oldest champions in League, but he's not super straightforward. I think that's one of the main reasons that we don't see him a lot of the times, especially in the mid lane, in lower elos. Typically, you see Ryze a lot in like pro play, you see him in really high elo. Not to say that he's not played in lower elo, but he's just not quite as common, in my opinion, considering how old the champion is and how long that he's been around. Hovering at about 3% pick rate between all the different elos. But with that being said, I do think that Ryze is one of those champions that every single mid laner should know how to play and kind of have him as a comfortable pocket pick because he's so strong against certain team comps. But let's go ahead and just first dive into some of his pros and cons. I'd list his pros and cons as this. Very strong map impact after level 6. Now, level 6 is very interesting on him because if we hover over his level 6, his passive overload damage bonus against targets with flux is increased to 50%. We'll talk about all that here in a minute. But his level 6 is more than just a teleport. A lot of people think it's just a teleport. He actually gets a large damage amp from hitting level 6. So that's a big pro. Point and click root on his W. Most roots in this game, most stuns, whatever, they are not point and click. They're skill shots. So this is very nice to have. A huge AoE due to his flux and how he can spread that. Very tanky once he kind of gets the ball rolling through his Archangel's staff, which provides a shield, through the stacks on the Rod of Ages. And he's pretty simple, once you kind of get past standing like how to reset his Q, how to apply flux, you get like his two basic combos down. In my opinion, he's a pretty easy champion. Some of the cons, you have to be very careful with him. You cannot blind pick Ryze, in my opinion. Because he is very, very weak against certain champions. Any champion that can like body block your Q essentially. So, I kind of struggled a lot against Malzahar, Neferi as well with her little wolves or her little dogs. They can body block your Q very easily. And while yes, you can spread your flux on these minions to kill them somewhat quickly, it doesn't really have the mana pool to sustain that. Another con, he does have very short range. He's very susceptible to gank. He is so, I cannot stress this enough, how he's so weak before level 6. You have to have tier and you have to have catalyst on this champion, and you have to invest like 1,500 gold to make him feel decent. Even then, he's still pretty weak. Yeah, very, very weak into a lot of meta mid lane comps. That's kind of why I said you can't really blind pick him. You kind of want to play him into certain team comps. Tons of mana issues very early, and you're going to often lose lane. So let's talk about him a little bit. So let's start with his passive Arcane Mastery. Ryze gains max mana, and his abilities do additional damage based on his bonus mana. So the more mana that you have, the more damage that you do. And that's one of the main reasons that we build our Archangel Staff here. And in a typical build, there's only going to be like 2 items that give you a whole bunch of mana. That's going to be your Archangel Staff, and that's also going to be your Rod of Ages. So that's why we go those 2 items early. We get the stacking effect from the Rod of Ages, of course. You see on Archangel's Staff, this will actually transform into something called Seraph's Embrace at 360 max mana. Right, that goes hand in hand with the tier that you're stacking early. But yeah, that's how mana plays into his passive. Let's move on. Let's go into his Q, Overload. So it has a passive and an active effect. So Rune Prison and Spell Flux are going to refresh his ability's cooldown and charge a rune for 4 seconds. We've not talked about runes yet. And the active on this is he's going to unleash a blast, dealing magic damage to the first enemy hit. If the target has flux on it, it's consumed, causing this ability to deal increased damage and bounce to a nearby enemy with flux. So let's first just take a look at this. So just baseline Q by itself is just this bolt of arcane damage that goes out essentially. Now it talks about runes and stuff. We'll talk about the runes here in just a second. You kind of ignore that for now. But I want to talk about flux. So flux is your E. So let's just jump over to flux. So spell flux. Ryze fires an orb dealing damage and applies flux to the target nearby enemies. So we can flux it. You see it gets a ring around it, and then I can Q, and you can see it did bonus damage, 634, and it had a crit icon. So without it, no crit icon. With it, crit icon. So flux makes your abilities essentially do way more damage. Now, one thing you'll notice, if we go back to our Q, go back to the passive effect, Rune Prison and Spell Flux refresh the ability's cooldown and charge a rune for 4 seconds. So what you always want to do, you pretty much always want to start your combo with a Q, because your E and your W just resets it for free, right? So I can go up to this and I can Q, E, Q, because my E reset the cooldown on it. And with Ryze, you're kind of weaving spells back and forth. You're kind of going like QW, QE, QW, Q, back and forth as much as you can so that we can get resets on our Q. Again, both your W and your E will will reset the cooldown on your Q. Okay, let's talk about the runes now for just a second. So at the very bottom, you'll see Ryze also discharges all runes, granting him movement speed for 2 seconds if 2 runes were discharged. So you'll know how many runes you have through these 2 dots right here. So when I go ahead and Q, or excuse me, when I go ahead and E, you'll see I have built up 1 rune. And if I E again, I built up 2 runes. And when I Q, I discharge them and I get a huge move speed bonus. And that move speed bonus can make or break you in a team fight. It's literally insane. It makes Ryze very slippery, very hard to catch. Now you only build up to those 2 runes though if you W and E before your next Q. So for example, if we E and then Q, it uses up the rune. If we E and then Q, it uses up the rune, and you don't get the big move speed bonus. Now we did get phase rush there, but that wasn't the move speed bonus from the rune. So that's another thing that makes rune really slippery, is he has both phase rush and he has the movement speed bonus from his Q, from his runes. So just got to keep that in mind. In a typical combo, a lot of the times I would like to Q, W, E, Q. That way I get the rune proc and I still get the flux damage. So I like to use my rune prison as much as I possibly can for its slow effect. Now, we're not talked too much about rune prison. Let's talk about this first. Ryze deals magic damage and slows by 50% for 1.5 seconds. If the target has flux, it's consumed and we root instead of slowing. So this is your point and click root that we talked about earlier. So we can flux and root, or we can not flux and slow. So flux W is a root. You can see this prison, and then we'll wait for W to reset. There we go. Let's just auto refresh cooldowns. And then we could just W by itself without flux. And we didn't get the rune prison. Instead, that's a slow. So do not underestimate the damage of rune prison. It does a significant amount of damage. And a lot of the times there could be like a cannon minion or something. I will snipe cannons with my W just to make sure that I get it. But yeah, I think we pretty much talked about all of his base spells and his passive. Let's talk about his ult really quick. So passive overload damage bonus against targets with flux are increased to 50%. So the name of this is called overload. And anything, once you hit level 6, basically it's a huge power spike for you, because not only do you get your ult that can travel pretty far, but your flux's damage is increased by 50%. So I think earlier we were hitting for like 700 damage crit with our flux. So if we take a look now we're hitting for 800 damage. Now we do have a fully stacked rod now. But actually most of that damage was coming from that level 6 that we just got. And what this does is essentially this will just teleport you and all of your allies to a location. So this is the bread and butter of Ryze, and the way that you'll want to play him in lane is you'll want to shove your lane out as much as you possibly can and then look for roams, either top or bot. And Ryze's roam is about 50% faster than a normal mid laner due to his ultimate. So if we take a look at his ult, you can see that it is extending on our mini map in the bottom right. It's extending to about here, and I'm here. So you can see just how far you could travel and how much more quickly you can gank. So a lot of the times I'll notice a fight breaking out bot. I'll shove my lane as much as I possibly can, and I'll start walking bot. And I'm just kind of watching the fight, and I'm watching my bar. And as I get closer and closer to the bot lane, let's say they're fighting right here, I'm going to be warping right here. And now these guys are going to be pinned, and they're not going to have anywhere to go. That is how I normally pick up kills on Ryze. And now it's kind of obvious, right, why he kind of struggles with other mages that can shove back into him, because you can't shove and roam as well playing against like a Malzahar. You're just like stuck in lane essentially. So the high damage combo, it depends on what you want. If you want the move speed bonus, it's going to be Q, W, E, Q. Let me take off the auto refresh cooldowns because it doesn't make sense. So Q, W, E, Q if you want that big move speed bonus. Now, if you instead want maximum damage, it's going to be Q, W, Q, E, Q. Right? Because we're going to get more resets on our overload. And if you want full CC, it's going to be Q, E, W, Q. So yeah, there's really like 3 combos in total. Typically, I like to start out with the WE combo. So like a Q, W, E, Q. I know I could have gotten that extra overload in there with that Q reset from W, but I really like to get that move speed proc. It gives me a little bit more utility, a little bit more positioning. That's like if I'm ganking or something. If I'm in just like a straight up duel with my laner, then I will probably opt into the more damage, like a Q, W, Q, E, Q, something like that. And then from there, it's just literally Q, E, Q, W, Q, E, Q, E, Q. You know, after you get that initial combo off, you're literally just weaving back and forth between Qs and Ws and Qs and Es. Okay, let's talk about like itemization. We talked a lot about itemization already, but let's talk about like runes, items, max order. So ability max order, you can start W. The guide does kind of recommend to start W, but W does cost a bit more mana than your Q. I normally just start Q. I normally start like Q, E, then W. This says to go W, E, Q. You can do what you want. W is a point and click. It's guaranteed damage at level 1. But you'll notice after a couple games of Ryze that his mana is very important. And wasting level 1 like 30 or 40 extra mana is like, it's basically like you going to lane with 10% less mana essentially by using W instead of Qs. So something to keep in mind there. But yeah, so that's his max order. You go Q, E into W. Take ult whenever available. For his runes, he's going to go sorcery because phase rush pairs very, very well with his rune system, getting that move speed buff. This is also going to give us that slow resistance. And this is another thing that makes Ryze so slippery. He's tanky. He does a lot of damage. He's hard to lock down. He's literally all over the map with his ultimate, teleporting all over the place. He's also taking teleport as one of his summoners here. So Ryze is just, in my opinion, he's such a versatile champion. This is why I think that everybody should learn to play Ryze. So phase rush, mana flow band. This is another thing we didn't talk about yet. So if you don't know how mana flow band works, basically when you hit an enemy with an ability, there's a cooldown on this. You have to wait for it to recharge, but every time a charge is ready and you hit an enemy with an ability, you get 25 mana up to 250 max. Once you hit that 250 mana threshold, you're going to start regenerating 1% missing mana every 5 seconds. Which is huge for your lane sustain, and the earlier that you could stack this, the better. So Ryze actually has a kind of cheeky way to stack this. So yeah, let's start with this flux here. So, and I didn't really showcase this earlier. So we can we can hit our flux on the middle target dummy, and you can see it spread to these 2 targets. And then I can Q, and now it did a ton of AoE damage. I don't know why I forgot to talk about that earlier. That's like literally so important. It stinks I can't show you this because I've already fully stacked my mana flow band. But essentially what you could do is, let's say, let me redo this. Let's say these 3 minions, or these 3 dummies are minions, and let's say that this back one is the enemy champion. So what you can do is you can flux these minions, and notice how it's spread to the champion in the very back. That will proc your mana flow band. So if somebody is standing close to a wave, just getting your flux off and running away is a huge win because you can easily stack your mana flow band with it. And again, the quicker you stack that, the more you're going to get the quicker you're going to get that 1% mana return every 5 seconds. So a very, very important tip. Always try to stack your mana flow band with your flux. We also have Transcendence, Mobility Haze. Pretty much all mages take Transcendence right now. Just allows you to cast your abilities more often. Gathering Storm. He's a scaling champion, so, you know, Gathering Storm makes sense. You get more AP over the course of the game. Overgrowth, this is actually pretty decent against like a Malzahar, anything that has minions in your lane, because you can actually kill those little minions and kind of cheese Overgrowth stacks. Doesn't mean that you're strong against those type of champions necessarily, but it is just something to be aware of. And then a bone plating. When bone plating is up, this is a good time to go in for a trade. So make sure you're tracking that. Attack speed's pretty good. This going to help you take turrets faster. It's going to help you CS a little bit better. Adaptive force, and then health scaling. And then, yeah, I think we've talked about most of these items already. So here's another thing is when you start the game, it's going to recommend Doran's Ring. If it's a really, really hard lane, go Doran's Ring. But if you think that you can survive, and I'd say 75 to 80% of my games, I instead just take a tier. Because the Doran's Ring is kind of useless. It doesn't build into anything. And to be honest, I felt that my mana in the early game is just as good with Tyr as it is with Doran's Ring. So with Doran's Ring, right, you're going to get mana every second. We just look at it right here. So you get 1 mana every second, increase to 2 mana per 5 seconds after dealing damage to an enemy champion. If you can't get mana, heal for 45% of this value instead. Let's get the health and the AP from this. So if you're looking to like trade and lane and fight, Doran's Ring is good. But if you think it's just going to be like a pretty safe lane, I would just go ahead and get Tyr, because Tyr is giving you 240 mana, which early game is like 30% more mana. You're also getting the stacking effect from this, and you're also getting the helping hand from this for the more physical damage to minions. So overall, you know, I think the mana is honestly a little bit better if you end up going Tyr than Doran's Ring for that mana sustain. So yeah, this is a typical build right here. You could also go Frozen Heart if you're into like super auto attack based champions. That's totally fine. And yeah, guys, I think that's pretty much it for this video. Yeah, the main thing again is get comfortable with his combo. It's really not that hard. After a couple of games, you'll have it. Get comfortable with Flux. Get comfortable with stacking that mana flow band early. Get comfortable with surviving pre-6. If you could just survive pre-6, then you can kind of start to shove after you get your catalyst. So let me back really quick. I do want to show this. So an early game build is going to look something like this. You're going to want to Tyr early. And then once you get the Tyr, start going into your Rod of Ages immediately. Do not go into Archangel Staff just because you built a Tyr early. Once you have these like 3 items, you're like decently strong. Catalyst is such a strong item, especially on Ryze. If you don't know how it works, restore 10% of the damage taken from champions as mana, and also casting an ability heals for 25% of the mana spent. Also gives us health, also gives us base mana. So this is a great lane sustain item. This plus your Tyr, and I wouldn't say that you have like kill potential on anybody, but you're pretty much chilling in lane once you get these 2 items. So at level 6, you're probably going to have these 2, and you really don't get kill potential, to be honest, until you complete a Rod. Even then, you really don't get kill potential until you get like an Archangel Staff and boots. Once you have these 3 items, you're a pretty decent champion. You're going to be on equal footing with pretty much everybody, especially when this thing hits 10 stacks. But yeah, just kind of ranting. I did kind of want to show what that early build looked like. Anyways, that's it for this video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. See you in the next one.